And I'm Karen Thorndike, President of the Historical Society, and if any of you, and a lot of you have been to our meetings up on Main Street, it's a good thing we came down here this time, because we would be out on the side on Highland Street also with an overflow. I'm so glad to see everybody here. I think it's time to hear our speaker, and John's going to introduce the speaker.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. We are very proud to offer an 8-part program series this year as we celebrate our anniversary. And first I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of Meredith Village Savings Bank. They have offered to be our prime sponsor to help underwrite some of our costs and pulling all of our programs together. So a big thank you out to MVSB for their support of our program. As I mentioned, tonight's program is the first of an 8-part a series of 8 programs. There are flyers in the back if you're interested in subsequent programs. It's the first Tuesday evening of every month from tonight forward all the way through to November. And Fritz Weatherby will be our guest in November to sort of close out things on a lighter note. So feel free to take one of those flyers if you have an interest in some of the other topics. The program should last about an hour. There should be plenty of time for questions and answers tonight. Tonight's program is entitled Meredith's Natural History, Setting the Stage. And presenting tonight is Dr. Rick Vanderpool. Rick is the principal of Ecosystem Management Consultants out of Sandwich, New Hampshire. Since 1988, Rick has completed bioinventories and land management plans for both the private and public sector on over 300,000 acres of land, which includes a comprehensive natural resource inventory for the town of Meredith that both my department here in town and the Conservation Commission rely upon extensively. That was completed in 2009. Rick has taught a number of courses in environmental science at the undergraduate level and graduate level since 1978. In New Hampshire, he's taught dozens of workshops and seminars on all aspects of natural history for over 35 years. So I hope you enjoy the program tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Vanderpool.
Thank you, John. First we'll test a mic, do a little mic test. Is that a little better? Yeah, yes. Okay. Now I'm going to take it out and do it this way instead of craning my neck. And John, of course, said Fritz Weatherby's going to end the program series on a light note, so I'm just going to be real heavy. You're going to have to deal with it, folks. This is an honor for me to be up here once again in the town of Meredith. I've always enjoyed coming here. I don't know how many programs I've done here, John, but you know, he keeps me well employed, I'll say that. And in terms of being on the land in Meredith, it's one of my favorite towns in the Lakes region for a lot of different reasons, and I will hopefully be able to communicate some of those tonight. Like John said, it's going to be about an hour program, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little more, but certainly there'll be plenty of time for questions. Given the light situation, I think once the lights go down, we'll probably wait for the questions to the end. And then we'll bring the lights back up so I can see you and see what you're asking and maybe hear you a little better. So that's what we'll sort of run through the slideshow to start. And again, and I always start a program by asking, because this is one of those things, you know, especially as we tend to lose our hair and it turns white and so forth, we forget what we came here to ask. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask a question now before I fill you with so much information you won't even remember what you wanted to ask at the end. So if anybody has a burning question at the start, and maybe I can, you know, integrate that into the slideshow as well. Anyone? This is your last chance before I hypnotize you. Okay, we'll go ahead and hit the lights and I'll start right up. Town of Meredith, setting the stage. As John said, this slideshow is largely about the natural resources of this town and what the settlers faced when they got here. So as the website, thank you, Meredith Webmaster, whoever that might be, indicates, Meredith was first known as Palmer's Town, in honor of Samuel Palmer. a teacher of surveying navigation, laid out much of the town. But this was soon changed to the town of New Salem, since a lot of the Masonian proprietors' grantees were from the town of Salem, Massachusetts. Well, Governor Wentworth wasn't going to have that, and he redubbed the name in 1768, Meredith, after the third baronet. Anybody know what a baronet is? I'm clueless myself, but military person for sure, back in the pre-revolution, to after Sir William Meredith, and this person, of course, thankfully was in opposition to taxation of the colonies. I thought that was interesting. So that's a preview of what you will see in the future, but the question that John had me address was, you know, where did they settle and what kind of world did they settle in? And for this, I'm just going to reach over here and see if I can get this to, I had this all set up before. There we go. Give you a little zoom view of where we are on the planet and what it looks like from space. Town of Meredith, a land of forest and water. Of course, this is a recent photograph, but consider that all of those lines and open field areas covered by snow in that shot, imagine them disappearing. And then all you have is this dark green forested landscape, largely surrounded by water, at least in this part of the world. And how did it get this way? Well, this is a piece of geological history that may be of interest to some of you. Back here again, see if we can get this going. Technical difficulties. This is a wonderful video that I grabbed off of YouTube that shows the continental movements, the movements of the continent. And that's not going to come up. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But in short, the geological basis of this town, not unlike all the other towns in the Lakes region, was premised on the fact that we had millions and millions of years of history that changed the actual structure of the bedrock upon which we stand today. And in a sort of quick order, if we look at the geological map of New Hampshire and focusing on Meredith here, we see some dark areas. In my slide, it's bright pink, but on this projector, it's gray, and then some lighter areas around it. Now, I should, before I tell you which is which, how many of you think this is the Granite State? Well, most of you should. Don't take it for granted. If you do, you're full of schist. Mica schist, 56% of the state is this lighter shaded geological formation known as metamorphic rock. It's either metasedimentary or metavolcanic rocks that formed millions of years ago. We'll throw some dates out in a second, but that is really the largesse of our state. The upwelling magma domes, which we see around the Ossipes and in what they call the Winnipesaukee Trough right here, is much younger and actually a much smaller part of the state, even though we are known as the Granite State. And of course, the Concord granite, very famous, Boston buildings built by Concord granite, gave us that sort of, epithet right up. It's like, what happens when the old man falls? You got to come up with something good, So we are, nonetheless, surrounded largely by this mica schist formation, at least in the western part of the town, and then, sure enough, in the basin of the Winnipesaukee Basin, you have mostly granitic materials. When you look at the ages of some of these, the oldest, like I mentioned, is the mica schist, dating back 408 to 415 million years ago in the Silurian period largely, but some in the Devonian as well. We have some ridges of resistant Devonian materials in the very western part of the town. And these are largely composed of old seabed sediments that have been pressurized and crushed many thousands of feet below the surface of the earth, again, during that period of in this case, the coming together of the continents, which you would have seen if the video was working, of Africa, South America, and North America. All three of those continents came together, and during that period, there was this tremendous subduction of the North American continental plate down into the sea, 28,000 feet below which you now have at the surface materials called amphibolite, sillimanite, muscovite, diopside, and garnet as the principal minerals that form the bedrock that we actually spend a lot of time and back-breaking hours moving out of the way. Can you imagine being a colonist building stone walls? I am glad I was born in the 20th century and not the 19th. In any case, that's the oldest stuff in town. In terms of the youngest rock, that's part of that quartz, monzonite, or what they call granite, that came up when the continents started to pull apart. And you had this great mountain range, the Acadian Mountains, that were a part of that, and that point of contact and then gradual rifting apart. The earliest stuff, which we have in the Winnipesaukee Trough, dates to 392 plus or minus 3 million years, and that's a radioisotope date that Eugene Boudet did for the New Hampshire Geological Office. And then we have over in the Ossipes much more recent stuff. That's only about 162 million years. Much more recent, just yesterday practically, in terms of geological history. And that, of course, happened at the time that the continents were pretty far apart and they were stretching so much that these big chunks of land just fell down and forced the upwelling of volcanic materials. That's what the Ossipes are all about. So we have some of that rock around the neighborhood as well. So that's the real, paper napkin short version of our geological history that the colonists had no choice but to face when they got here. Now we had this other thing called glaciers that also had a big effect on what they faced. And let's see if we can get this one going. I sure hope so. Nope. Let's try that. No? Okay. This is working at home, and I'm not quite sure why, but that's not going to work. It's not red. Okay. So, in any case, that picture right there shows the maximum glacial extent at roughly the time period when vegetation started to return to this area. Okay? This was the last of 4 major ice sheets starting at about 365,000 years ago, and every about 100,000 years there would be this return of continental ice that would drop down from the poles and cover the northern part of the United States, the lower 48, all the way down to the base, of course, of the Great Lakes, all the way down to Cape Cod, which is a terminal moraine for our Wisconsin ice sheet. And as you can see from this picture, and had the video played, you would see how it receded over time to where really the only residential sort of landmass ice sheet is present in Greenland at this point in time. But it covered the entire northern part of our continent and created a tremendous, tremendous effect in terms of the materials that were there to begin with, that is to say, those bedrock materials we talked about earlier. The glacial landscape is covered with all of the evidence of having a mile of ice scrape across at a very slow rate this land for many, many miles. That is to say, glacial striations that we can see actually continue for several miles in certain areas of the state, mostly on the ridge tops. But locally, we had all kinds of variations to the movement of the ice that created the conditions we see today. thin soils, ledges that are exposed, like we see here, looking down from Lad Mountain to Winnisquam in the Chemung area. We see some, deposits of rock at the base of these hills. And all of these features were glacially derived, obviously dictated to some degree by the bedrock geology, which was variously soft in certain areas and variously hard in others. A typical hilltop had stones right at the surface, ledge rock right at the surface, and then of course very thin soils on either side of the crest, with the deeper soils obviously down in the valley. And if you think about that, the hard scrabble of New England. Any of you from Vermont by any chance? Yeah, okay. Well, see now, I'm not sure why you're here in Vermont, in New Hampshire, but Vermont had it much easier. Consider the fact that Vermont's rocks are almost 1 billion years old in certain parts. At least 400 million years older than ours, which means there was a lot more erosion over in Vermont, which created deeper soils. Plus, the seabed sediments in Vermont had more calcium. You want to grow corn? Don't live in New Hampshire. Move across the river into Vermont. You have a much easier time. And we could take this a long, long ways. Politically speaking, culturally, whether you can get medical marijuana or not, all that relates to the bedrock, which is very different in Vermont. So we've got these glacial landscapes, and the settlers had to deal with them. The first and most obvious thing that they had to deal with was abundant surface stones and boulders. Better get them out of the way if we want to grow crops. Even if we want to have sheep and cows that don't trip over them and break their legs and be useless as livestock animals, we better get them out of the way. But then, where are we going to grow our crops? We have fairly thin and coarse acidic soils. And okay, so yes, we lost about half of our population to the Ohio Valley after the Civil War because they realized, I don't have to move stones out there. But for those who stayed, they just persisted at it. Moved those stones, added more nitrates to the soil to grow better crops. But they couldn't always deal with things based on the geology that forced them into certain parts of town in order to settle and raise their families. So when you add the vegetation, which that glacial ice extent slide showed, starting about 11,900 years ago, you started to then change the way the surface of the land actually chemically and biologically supported things like soil. All right, so after that much plant contribution, we actually started to gain a little bit of organic material. Nothing like the Great Smokies, if you've ever been down the Southern Appalachians, or for that matter, in the coastal plain of North Carolina and Georgia, where the soils, wow, it's a different story down there. No glaciation. Holy smokes. It's a little warmer, so things tend to break down faster. I'm not so, keen on how thin the soils are down there, but here, wow, it took thousands of years to get that organic material that we would then turn in to the soil in order to grow crops. And so when you start in Meredith, you look first and foremost, you got a lot of blue out there. Not going to do much there except maybe fish. Hydric soil and light green, that's the wet soils. Unless you want to grow, wild rice or something like that, you're probably not going to work those soils. So really what you've got left are these stony glacial tills, and that's, again, what was left by the glaciers roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years ago after they finally receded. Then when you drill down into the productivity of those soils a little bit more, you have a few other things that get in the way. Again, water and wetlands in blue. Now you see a little bit more extensive in terms of the very high water tables that have prevented settlers from growing crops. And only in green, really, these dark green colors, you have suitable, what they call prime farmland soils. And this becomes sort of a critical factor when you are trying to earn a living, grow crops, raise livestock, support a family, and then let alone have time to go to Monday night selectmen meetings, you know. You've got a lot on your plate, and so to do that, you best want to find places like, you know, Moulton's Farm, or Longview Farm, Picnic Rock, you know, places where these dark green areas are that produced much better growing till than the stony glacial tills elsewhere. And you also want to stay away from these orange areas that are kind of steep and the red areas which are really steep, better than 25%, because let's face it, you know, tractors and carts and oxen don't do as well on these steep side slopes as they do on the flat. So again, the landscape really shaped the people and the settlement patterns in this town, just like it did pretty much any town in New Hampshire. What we had after we decided, yes, certain soils were deep enough, we could call them prime farmland and identify them, what we had was a designation of roughly 584 acres left of that prime farmland soil in Meredith, which, let's face it, that's not very much. You know, it's basically 1% and maybe 1.8% of the total size of the town. So that's a precious commodity, and I'm happy to report, as most of you know, both of these real active working farms are permanently protected, thanks to the wisdom and the foresight of people like John and other folks in the room, and you know who I'm talking to. I'm looking at you. I know. I can see something. So that is, I mean, let's, you know, talk about a good, you know, social security, you know, plan for your future generations. Being able to grow crops, that's kind of important. Why not protect the best land in town, especially if there's only 1% or 2% of that left. So secondly, they also face this sort of water thing. Now, of course, water isn't such a bad thing when you're talking about food, right? And we learned very quickly, actually the earliest of settlers and explorers learned very quickly that water was super important, not only for food, but for fur. And we'll talk a little bit more about that relative to the sort of pre-contact experience of the folks that were here before settlement. But certainly when it comes to fish and other aquatic organisms, that water is a good thing. 1/4 of the town, by the way, open water lakes, 5 lakes, 7 some odd named ponds, another handful of unnamed ponds. So a lot of water in town, plus you've got these high water table areas called wetlands, and not to mention the perennial streams. So there was a fair amount of water on the landscape that the settlers had to deal with. There's your current summary, 8,850 acres of lake, open water bodies, 5 lakes, 11 ponds, 233 acres, 6 major wetlands, which we now have designated in this town prime wetlands. It's been a while now since that designation, but it's one of 33 towns in the state that has so designated the large, really important wetlands as prime. We also have a number of so-called minor wetlands called designated wetlands, 768 acres, plus 87 more complexes that are even smaller at 313 acres, plus 13 perennial streams, or 27 miles of streams. As most of you know, coming around the corner of the 19th century, water power became a pretty important part of this town. Again, I'm not going to go into that. That's in future talks to find out about the details of things like that. But again, the water, not just the open water bodies, but the moving water was critical for a number of different reasons as settlers came into this town. So water, of course, gets affected by climate, and it has its own sort of limitations here in the post-glacial Northeast. If you were in Hawaii, certain things you wouldn't have to own, like snow shovels and ice creepers on your feet, you know, unless you're walking up to Mauna Loa or something like that. But point being is that the settlers here, some of which were from temperate and boreal landscapes coming over from Europe, had to deal with water in all shapes and forms. And just a couple of statistics here which I want to point out, and that's something that we can tend to forget, really. Maybe not as readily as some things, but for instance, the mean annual temperature when the settlers arrived was 42.5 degrees. It is now 46.8. And I think you know why it's a little warmer. At least you can come up with your own theories. Mean high temperature 55.4, now it's 56.8, so a little bit of a bump there. The mean low temperature 34.7, now 36.8. But here's where it gets interesting. When you add a little bit more cold temperature to that water, not just in the landscape, but also as in precipitation, we have increased from 45.7 inches average, and this is for the Lakeport weather station climatologically, and they have records dating back to the 1890s. From 45.7 to 47.48 inches average per year. But look at the snowfall. When the settlers were here, 92.5 inches of average snowfall per year. Look at how that has dropped in the last 10 years. That's a significant number. I'm sure that they would have rather seen this number than the 92 inches part relative to their efforts to sustain themselves. But that's a big number, and that, of course, that's going to continue to change as we're seeing this projected out. But the fact that water freezes on this planet is not all a bad thing, and certainly it is something that had its place. For example, how well would we be able to stock our ice boxes if there was no frozen water to deal with? How well could we store our food over the winter? And so on. And so this temperate latitude is actually kind into us in certain ways, again, using water as a medium and factoring climate into that. And that's something that we also tend to forget. I lived for a lot of years in the desert Southwest, and you know, I'm still always amazed when I go back there and the things that I take for granted. Oh yeah, I'm just going to turn on the tap and wash my dishes. And no, you cannot just do that. You know, unless you are really not paying attention, or if you think your well is you know, deep enough and a great enough aquifer, you can sustain that kind of flow. Here we can take that for granted, but down there, and in most parts of the world, the amount of water we have is not present at the surface. And that's something that, again, to the benefit of the settlers when they got here, but certainly something that can be a detriment in most other parts of the settled North American continent at that time of the history. All right, so then the third and perhaps one of the most important things in terms of what the settlers faced was the uplands and the forest itself. And as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow dubbed it, he called it the forest primeval. The murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss, in garments green, indistinct in the twilight, stand like druids of eld, with voices sad and prophetic, stand like harpers hoar with beards that rest on their bosoms. Wadsworth, among others of the romantic writers of the 19th century, casting his description of the landscape and depicting what we, again, most of us are not readily aware of. We see a very different forest today than the settlers saw back in the 17th century. Very, very different. And the permanent settlers in the 18th century, very different landscape. Back then we had forests that were dominated by large trees and deep shade and fern and mossy undergrowth. And certainly that was variable according to how much water was in the landscape. But to put it in perspective a little bit, here's Peter Miller, who showed me this black gum tree on the left, which is the oldest tree, I believe, in Meredith. And by the bark structure, we estimated it at about between 575 and 600 years old. This tree was here when the settlers arrived. This tree was here 200 years before the settlers arrived. Similarly, we have white ash and sugar maple in some of our older northern hardwood stands on Ladd Mountain that were here when the settlers arrived. And this hemlock, which we estimate, and this is also up in Hamlin, recreation area, estimated at about 450 years old. So we still have trees that will bring us back, connect us directly. You touch the bark, and the bark has been there 5 to 8 times longer than you've been alive. Still have those old trees present in town, but consider that the entire town was made up of those trees. With a few exceptions, and we'll go into some of that, but most of this forest was comprised of trees in their maximal ages, between 200, say, years for a birch, and almost 1,000 years for certain types of cedar, the northern white cedar. But certainly 700 years on our black gum trees, so-called buttonwood trees. Of the forest primeval, roughly 65% of town were considered uplands. And these are, of course, areas where the water table is low enough that the trees will grow to their full maximum. Okay? And that, is interspersed, as you can see here, with vernal swamps and pools that are tiny and included in those forested landscapes, as well as riparian zones along the streams. But for the most part, look at that, 90%, and this is from a land cover type map that was devised in 2001 by NOAA, hemlock and hardwood forest. We're in the middle part of the state. We're in the central mixed hardwood softwood forest of the state. It extends actually from the southern part of New Hampshire all the way up along the Connecticut River, almost to Canada. And in the Lakes region, it reaches its maximum extent in terms of diversity of species and ages. So our oldest black gum trees we actually see around the Lakes region. Our oldest hemlock trees we see here, our oldest red spruce trees we see in this part of the state. And by this part, I mean not just the Lakes region, but right up to the sort of southern slopes of the White Mountains. So that mixed hardwood forest, and when you start thinking about it, well, we've got softwood that we can work readily with in terms of lumber, white pine, hemlock. We've got hardwoods that will fuel our fires in the winter and boil down our sap in the spring. And we've got a mix of these, like ash, that will make excellent tools, will help us in our boat construction. We've got birch bark, which we can mimic the natives by making birch bark canoes. All these different tree species actually was a boon to the settlers when they got here. And having them in all different age classes in these mixed primeval forests were a boon. Almost 6% is comprised of what is called the northern hardwood coniferous forest. And this, of course, is the most common forest of Coos County and to the north of here, somewhat at higher elevation. If you want to get a good sense of it, walk up Ladd Hill or Levitt Mountain sometime. That's where you'll see a forest dominated by northern hardwoods. This is the maple, sugar maple, the beech, and the yellow birch. Those are the sort of three sisters, as it were, of the northern hardwoods, plus spruce mixed in. So we have, of the conifers, mostly spruce, now more spruce than hemlock in terms of the northern hardwood conifer forest. And occasionally we have these nice, beautiful beech stands. And of course, beech, another fantastic wood, not just for firewood, but beech pegs and all of our barrel staves. And there were a number of uses for beech because it had a particular type of strength to it and fibrous growth. It also produced beech nuts, which we don't harvest much anymore. I think the bears take the most of it these days. But we did once upon a time harvest beech nuts and use those. And of course, the one tree I'm not mentioning, all right, this is the quiz part, that we don't have today, but the settlers had and was an incredibly valuable tree that produced good wood and hard mass nuts. Chestnut. Absolutely. And here again, we're at that place in the state where chestnut, American chestnut, was near its maximum in terms of height and age. Interestingly, of course, chestnut extended well up into central Maine and into the central part of Coos County. But here in the Lakes region, that mixed forest chestnut was a huge part. And in fact, whereas now, you know, I've got these, it's so-called the scattered beech forest, you could just substitute scattered chestnut forests if you would take this back 100 years before the blight. As many of you know, the chestnut, by the way, the American Chestnut Foundation has been fairly hard at work, shall I say, and fairly successful. We get up to their 5th generation. I help manage a chestnut plantation in southern New Hampshire with 1,000 trees, and we're getting closer. It's hopeful that before the end of our lifetimes here, we'll be able to plant out a disease-resistant chestnut back into the northeastern forest. Consider that from southern New England to northern New England, chestnut represented over 40% of the dominance, canopy dominance. So it was a huge loss starting in the early 1900s in terms of the chestnut blight. So that's another factor. And then last but not least, and you'll see a couple of little tiny sort of bluish-green dots here. We had a little bit of that lowland, what they call lowland spruce fir forest. That's what the Fish and Game folks call it. Other folks call it the lower montane forest. All right, so again, the northwest part of Levitt Mountain, the north part of Ladd Hill, and a little bit on Bigelow, there's these little tufts of largely spruce. If you're not quite familiar with that, either drive up north to Bretton Woods and look up the mountain, or go look at the top of the Ossipes, where Mount Shaw and Blacksnap is coated with this dark evergreen forest. That's all spruce fir. So we have just a little bit of it right here in Meredith, where I live in Sandwich, and we have quite a bit more. And of course, as we go north, it becomes the dominant forest type as we get into Canada. So in that forest, of course, we've got abundant wildlife. And this is absolutely, and was absolutely key to the settlers' success, because consider that for over 100 years, before we actually had full-time residents here, before the land grants were chartered, and the Masonian proprietors were doling them out to lawyers mostly, interestingly, from Salem. I must say, Salem lawyers. If I was going to be a lawyer, I think I would have lived in Salem. Because A, I would have been in good company, and B, I would have probably gotten a land grant to wherever I wanted to go in New Hampshire. Now, there was just a few things in the way, and we'll get to that in a minute, but like Indians and the fact that there were no roads and certainly no power lines and electricity and all that stuff. But we had wildlife, and the game here was abundant. And interestingly, it formed the actual means of exchange. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second, but look at what we had. Moose, right? Moose was obviously a northern, boreal forest member, but that came down into the Lakes region and survived here and did well and was a huge benefit for anybody able to take a moose down. Think of your entire winter meat supply being provided by a single animal. That could make or break your survival here. Deer, of course, were plentiful. They weren't as plentiful as they are today. There's some estimates that say there were between 6 and 10 deer per square mile. Today we have a minimum of 13. We have upwards of 30 per square mile when you get into the southeastern counties. So, 3 or 4 times as many deer. But the Lakes region was sort of the northern end, or the northern extent of the deer population, native deer population in the state. We had, of course, lots of black bear, and that was, we didn't have to worry about garbage dump raiders at that time. But the bear were nonetheless a competitor for us as sort of top predators for the smaller game, not necessarily all deer fawns, but sometimes moose fawns and certainly other wildlife that the bear predated on. Bobcats were here in about the same numbers as they are today, believe it or not. And the reason that they weren't more abundant then is because we had another cat on the scene. This guy right here. And the catamount, or mountain lion, or puma, as a lot of the early writers called them, were present throughout the Lakes region. They were, of course, common throughout all of central and northern New Hampshire at that time. Lynx rarely strayed down from the White Mountains into this area. We may have had them on the sort of Levitt-Ladd Mountain, the highest points of town, but that was still present in the region and was actively traded as fur during that time. And again, keep in mind that initial contact in this part of the state with the native cultures and in trade began in the 1600s. Began actually in the early 1600s, 1620, 1621. Some of the earliest forts and trading posts were created in the coastal part of the state, and by the time we got into the 1640s, we actually had active trade routes going through New Hampshire that were supported by some of these fur bearers. Gray fox was present, red fox were present. They were also taken as fur, pretty much the only sort of use by the early settlers. And then, of course, this guy, the timber wolf. And a timber wolf, some of you have probably heard the famous story of the timber wolf raids up in Chicago and the big hunt of I think it was 86 or 8, something like that, where a lieutenant from the Civil War had mustered up a hunting party that killed the sort of last remnant howling beasts, as they called them. It was just in the 1880s. So wolves were here throughout the time of settlement and persisted well into the middle to late 1800s in the central part of the state. But there were some other wildlife species that weren't as abundant, and yet they were critically important for a number of different reasons. Anybody recognize this guy?
Wolverine.
Wolverine, indeed. We had wolverines not commonly in this part of the state, but all throughout Coos County. And they extended across North America in the boreal forest. So as we had just a little bit of boreal forest, not unlike pine martens, or sables as they call them, we had these boreal species that extended down into Meredith. And again, whereas these two are both predators, they were competitors for some of the other species that we sought, not the least of which was this guy right here. Beaver was the most important animal in our neighborhood when the settlers arrived, and yet they were already in decline. Think about it. What was the primary business of the fur trade? Beaver. And in fact, they call it a beaver trade because that was 90% or more of what was being traded. A lot of the original land grants, the grantees, as sort of an honorarium, as it were, or for good faith payment of their land grants, were paying the most Smithsonian proprietor lawyers in beaver pelts for the first several years. And of course, there was this sort of setup, and you'll hear more about this in subsequent talks, where they had, you had 6 years and you've got to get 10 acres under production, have so many stock, and you have to pay me so much within that 6 years, and after that period of time, you know, you own the land free and clear. Well, how are they going to pay it if they had no money? And beaver was the answer for some of the earliest settlers in terms of the cash crop that they could. And of course, that drove the trade with the natives, who had a much better sort of and more extensive trap line available to them to be able to, you know, make that sort of payment happen. And they traded with the natives on a number of different objects that the natives didn't have, brass, arrowheads, and so forth, that I'll show you in a second. So beaver was hugely important, and yet it was already in decline. We lost our last beaver in Coos County in 1865. And this is according to Helen Silver in her stories in her book called The History of the Fur Bearers of New Hampshire. 1865, we lost beaver completely. And in this region, we probably had no more beaver left by the late 1700s. So they were already in decline by the time the 1768 sort of charter was established. And then two other species. Anybody recognize that guy? Caribou, good, woodland caribou. Believe it or not, woodland caribou. Can you imagine walking up the stream bed, you know, coming through like Hawkins Brook and walking into the marsh and seeing caribou drink? I mean, that just, I cannot, I'm thinking I must be in Finland or something, you know. But in fact, this rangifer species was here at least until, and not commonly apparently, but at least until the 1750s and 1760s. And that was about the extent of it. The last one was shot in the early 1800s in New Hampshire. And then last but not least, this animal here, elk indeed, and wapiti as they were called in the east, were largely a western species. There's some debate as to how many we had. Most of our wapiti were along the Connecticut River and west, and as you got further towards New York, they became more and more common. It was more open grassland. There were more fires that supported that sort of woodland habitat they liked. Here in the sort of forest primeval of Meredith, they probably weren't very common. But wapiti were here, elk were here, at least until the mid-1700s in terms of this species, although they were reintroduced, interestingly enough, for a long period of time, between the let's see, it would have been the 1920s and the 1950s. And the reason that they didn't survive and why they were finally taken out, they kept eating people's gardens and apple trees and perennials, and the legislature in the 1950s and 1955, I believe it was, finally made it illegal to reintroduce these animals in the state. A couple other important wildlife species to the settlers. Of course, Canada geese were here, migratory geese, a little different than the subspecies we have today, and all of the waterfowl, even mallards, black ducks, wood ducks, hooded mergansers, much of the same waterfowl species, and these were shot and killed and eaten on a regular basis. Turkey was here. It wasn't as common as it is today. Think of the habitats turkey like. We didn't have the fields and the croplands yet when the settlers got here, so they were somewhat restricted in numbers, but they were still here throughout the state. Mourning doves were here as a small game, but the one that they really honed in on was the passenger pigeon. Good. And the passenger pigeon, there's your, oh boy, it doesn't show up at all. But in any case, that region right here extends of the sort of native range from Ohio all the way to Cape Cod, and you can see includes southern New Hampshire as the year-round range. And then in the summertime, the passenger pigeon would extend up to the St. Lawrence Seaway, southern Quebec, Ontario, eastern Manitoba, into central Nebraska, and North Dakota, South Dakota, and then down to about Missouri and across to southern Virginia. So that was the overall range of the passenger pigeon. 6 million birds estimated for the Northeast alone. and these birds would roost, as some of you have read, in trees by the thousands. And, you know, they made for an easy prey, as Audubon wrote and portrayed, and became a very valuable food source because, as they said, you could shoot one and the others would still stay there in the same place. Sitting ducks, yeah, I guess that might have been, sitting pigeons would have been a better way to put it. But that was another valuable food source. We, of course, did have native grouse as well, rough grouse, and they were, or partridge, as they were hunted regularly as well. So bird life, also very important in terms of supplying the earliest settlers with a food source. But, you know, let's talk fish here, because, you know, when you're coming up river, right, and you are better to be in the lakes region in a boat, right, to get around, rather than trying to slog your way through the forest, although there were a lot of Indian trails still present. What better way to survive your transport than to drop a line in the water, drop a net in the water, and pick up dinner on your way up? So salmon, a lot of debate, 1950s kind of settled it in terms of some early genetic studies where they looked at native salmon that are truly anadromous, going out to sea and coming back, versus the Winnipesaukee so-called landlocked salmon. And Winnipesaukee apparently was the only true lake that had landlocked salmon. At least that was reported in the sort of final Ralph Town report for Fish and Game. And that separated it from Newfound and Squam and other large lakes that had salmon that were released. It's a little hard to tell because, of course, the natives used that salmon base tremendously for their food sources, and especially their winter camps. And so a little hard to tell which lakes had native salmon, but certainly Winnipesaukee did. Eastern brook trout, another very popular species that was easily caught in the streams that were loaded with them. How about this guy? Anybody know that one? Cusk, indeed. Mad Tom, there's a couple of different names for him. But cusk, not only as a food source, but as a source of oil. Right? We're a little far from the coast. Whale oil is a little tough to come by, but cusk could also be rendered to provide an oil that was useful for a variety of different reasons. And then this one, anybody go smelt hunting? And smelt, you know, again, in their November migrations up the streams were tremendously easy to catch. You know, you dip a net in the water at night with lights and you could make a smelt, you know, dinner and in fact pack it away in salt, dry them, and have another winter food supply, especially since it was a fall running species. And then a lot of different minnows were used as bait. You know, there were a number of those that were dip netted and used not only just for fishing bait, but also for setting traps. Interesting little tidbit, I had forgotten this, and people have asked me in my programs, how did Fisher get its name? Anybody know? How did the Fisher, not Fisher cat, it's not a cat, get its name? So Helen Silver in her book writes that when they were hunting fur bearers and they would bait their traps with fish, and these animals, they called fishers, would steal the bait away from the sable or the bobcat or the fox or whatever the animal they were actually after. Because fishers were kind of notoriously ferocious. If they get one of those in the trap, watch out. Very difficult. So that's how they got their name. And again, it was, you know, a lot of these minnows were used as bait for that purpose, plus other fish parts. Okay, so last sort of small chapter, and this is an important one because it was not just one of the limiting factors for the settlers when they faced the base sort of set of natural resources, but the population of indigenous people here had also affected those natural resources for thousands of years. Makes sense, stands to reason, but how? So again, from Helen Silver's book, she actually derived and you know, interviewed a lot of different people to try and find out and, you know, what was the sort of common knowledge of the different tribes that were extant in the state of New Hampshire at the time of settlement. And this map is the best I've seen that sort of identifies where those different groups were. From the Winnecowas to the Swampscots, the Penobscoquakes, all the way up to the Ossapees closer to our region, and then largely up the Merrimack were the Penacooks. And the Penacooks, even in the earliest maps that the Iroquois helped their sort of French counterpart friends when they were battling the English draw, they called the central part of the state the Pennacook region. And that was a large, and as you get a little farther north and to the east, the term Abenaki comes in, and of course, Colin Holm and a bunch of other folks have dubbed the sort of band of Indians in the central and northern part of our state as the Western Abenaki. You know, so we had a number of different language groups and tribes that lived in the region, even though in this map, the Sacos and the Ossapees come closest to the Winnipesaukee, who were, of course, the largesse of the population that settled at the Weirs. So in that sort of aboriginal period, which spanned, you know, for several thousand years, and certainly just post-glacially, we had 3 different periods that are generally identified. The Paleo-Indian period from 11,500 to roughly 9,000 years ago. Bands, non-residential bands, non-nomadic bands of natives that had developed, you know, large spearheads, at that time fluted points that allowed them to hunt game and manufacture through their hides this sort of temporary wickiup shelter, which was perfect for the nomadic existence that followed large masses of game across the post sort of tundra northeast. And don't forget, at that time, 11,900 to probably about 10,000 years ago, the Meredith landscape was devoid of trees. They had tufts of spruces and firs, and it was largely a post-glacial tundra landscape. So that group, you know, occupied, again, roughly to the 9,000 year before present period, known as the Paleo-Indians. The next group, from 9,000 to roughly 3,000, they separate on the basis of what they left behind. Now we're talking a little bit more finer point tools, especially axes, which were used for a variety of wood carving efforts, including dugout canoes. We had the development of mortars and pestles, which suggested that they were already gathering enough hard mass to overwinter and create things like meal, which they would then use in their baking of bannock bread over the fire, and that meal probably was largely chestnut meal. This mortar right here is actually from down the street from me. It was discovered in the 1940s and was dated by the state archaeologists at the time back to about 4,000 years before present. So we have a lot of artifacts that are still, you can still find out on the landscape from this archaic period of native cultures. And then last but not least, the so-called woodland period, which lasted from 3,000 years before present. Very, very different in many, many respects. Perhaps most importantly, they were more residential. This was the culture that we largely traded with at the Weirs, that were residential. They said that the settlement there was more than 2/3 of a mile long and comprised of over 1,000 individuals at one point. And again, this was only because they had, with the benefit of Western and Southwestern Indian tribes like the Iroquois, developed agriculture, began to make pottery, stored grain, had bows and arrows that could capture not just the large spear point based game, but the smaller game like rabbits and skunks and raccoons and so forth. Fishing was more important and more well-developed. They had fishing weirs that they would trap large numbers of fish during their annual migrations, especially the inland salmon as they moved up the streams in the fall. And of course we had, like I said, at Weirs, at Lakeport there was a big population. Stone Dam Island was well known as a population center. And then of course, as you go a little farther west, the Pemigewassetts were settled around Newfound Lake, which that was a another huge population center, as evidenced by artifacts that we're finding on a regular basis at the mouth of the Cockermouth River. So we had a different culture, and perhaps this is actually called, you can't read that, it's a 1664 engraving of the Iroquois women with 3 sisters, and they're actually grinding grain from corn. They had beans and squash, and those were the sort of 3 sisters that were the base of their agriculture that made that happen. Thousands of years of effects on the natural landscape left quite a bit of evidence. The pre-settlement, pre-contact to settlement, based on the fur trade, as I mentioned, with beaver pelts as the principal commodity. But don't forget that by 1620 or so, we as non-continental European settlers introduced diphtheria, smallpox, plague, typhus, influenza, a number of diseases that effectively wiped out the native population. Some estimates are as high as 90%, but in our state, a more accurate, I think, figure, and that seems to be consistent with a number of historians, is more like 85% of the population died off within 10 years, maybe 15 years. And that's a huge, huge loss of life. They estimated over 30,000 residents south of the White Mountains in the state of New Hampshire alone. And so that dropped to about 5,000, which is consistent with Jeremy Belknap's History of New Hampshire estimates of the number of remnant native residents when the land grants were beginning. In the Lakes region, most of the natives that were still resident joined forces. Many of them moved north, especially to St. Francis, where there was a fairly large enclave of Abenakis that were settled up on the St. Lawrence River. But we still had a few people, native peoples here, when we settled in the 1740s and 50s. There were still a few, and some of the remaining residents, of course, integrated with the English settlers. Relative to their effects, what the settlers found by the time they got here in the 1760s, scattered encampments, small patches of former agriculture, small openings in the forest where they had burned openings and improved the soil till to grow the 3 sisters. A visible trail system, which interestingly is still visible today. If you know where to look and you're in the right place, you can still find old trails. And many of us drive them in our cars at this point, but that's still possible. Old fishing weirs, whether they're stone weirs, can still be found, or sometimes wooden weirs under the sediment. And of course, we still are finding dugout canoes. Not commonly, I think probably most of them have been tapped out, but I've heard of ones, there's a famous one from Squam, Newfound, Winnipesaukee. That particular one was found in Andover, New Hampshire, and these date back, several thousand years in certain cases. So that is the extent of my talk. I want to thank John and the planning department, Dan Hayduck, who wrote a wonderful history of the Page Pond that's online on the Meredith website, Peter Miller, Doug McLean, who provided some excellent artifact materials, and of course some of my other online citations. So thank you very much. Time for questions? So we have time for a couple questions. If anybody has any, feel free. Yes.
Rick, when you were talking, when you were going through the various tree species, you didn't mention pine.
Yes, I didn't mention pine. Pine in the closed canopy primeval forest was not common. It was only present where there was either active burns going on by largely indigents or in areas where there were large wind throws in the sandy flats around the lakes. But they were not a real common species at settlement. Good question. Yes?
I heard an archaeologist talk about the archaeological dig up in Holiness between Squam and Little Squam, and they discovered that he stated that approximately 1,000 years when there was no native activity. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I know Bob well, who did some of the work with Vicky Bunker on that site, and as far as I know, it's still not readily known why there was that long period of no occupation. There, disease is certainly suspect, because don't forget we had Vikings coming here, long before the European settlers, but there are other sources of disease that could have cropped up. I don't really know, and I'm not sure that that's widely, hasn't been figured out. But good question. Yeah. Any other questions? All set? Okay. Thanks for your time. Have a great evening.
Two things before we wrap up. I just want to remind everybody that we have refreshments in the back of the room. Please take your time to enjoy those. And Rick, if you could come back here for a second. On behalf of the Historical Society, we'd like to present you with that book. This is a commemorative book that's been prepared as part of the 250th Anniversary Committee, working with local folks and the Laconia Sun. As Karen had mentioned, our archives here at the Historical Society with the source material for many of those photos. So we just wanted to share that with you as a token of our appreciation. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much.